All right, everyone. Well, welcome to this virtual session. My name is Todd Herman, and I lead development for the Bobby Dodd Institute. Just wanted to say thank you so much for attending this workshop. We know that there are a lot of demands on your time, and so that we are incredibly grateful that you've chosen to spend the next 45 minutes or so listening to our panel of experts. Just wanted to let you know that the session will be recorded, and we will share via a link to it post meeting. So we're just thrilled, and you can watch it again at your leisure. But this is the inaugural webinar in the Igniting the Inclusive Workforce series. Really, the objective behind this entire series is to bring together all of the key players in the employment ecosystem, from nonprofits to employers to academic institutions, and of course, supported and unsupported employees, caregivers, and caseworkers, all with the focus on increasing the rate of employment for those living with a disability in the greater Atlanta area. Now, BDI and partners have brought together just a great array of speakers who really over the next year or so will address all sorts of topics dealing with advocacy and employment. And then this will all culminate in a live event that'll take place in October of 2021 at the City of Refuge. So I want to give you some background on the project, and really all of this began with a brainstorming lunch with Terry Blum at the Institute for Leadership and Social Impact at Georgia Tech, and Mark Crenshaw with the Center for Leadership and Disability at GSU. And from there, a steering committee was assembled, and they really have gratefully, led us to this current day. And I want to share with you just the members of that steering committee because they should be acknowledged for all of the work that they've done. And I also wanted to, tip my lid, give the hats off to Katie Rousseau, our project manager, as she's done fabulous work in helping this become a reality. Very important as well, a big thank you to our sponsors, Disability in Greater Atlanta. We're so grateful for them coming on board initially to support this project, as well as the Georgia Tech Institute for Leadership and Social Impact and the Excel program at Georgia Tech as well. We also have received funding from Atlanta Foundation. So we are so incredibly grateful for their support. And let me please plug that sponsorship opportunities are still available. But at this point, without further ado, I want to turn things over to Dave Kieran. He's going to be the moderator for today's session, and Dave is the Director of Adult Services with Autism Speaks. I'll hand the baton over to you, Dave. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Todd. And I'd like to thank Todd and Katie and Bobby Dodd Institute and our sponsors for hosting us today. Thank you for giving part of your Wednesday to this incredibly important topic for us all here in the Atlanta region and around the country. Todd mentioned the idea of an employment ecosystem. And I love that image, that the idea that we all have crucial parts to play if we're going to make this ecosystem work for all people with disabilities who are seeking employment that's appropriate to their skills, to their interests, to where they live, and to their own needs. So we have some wonderful panelists today to talk to you from several different perspectives. We have an employer who's also a family member. Then you're going to hear from two professional advocates who are also women with disabilities themselves and who have other personal and professional experiences that they'll be drawing from to talk about these issues today. I really do believe, I'm not an Atlanta person, I live up in the New York area, but I believe Atlanta is ripe, fertile ground for the development of an ecosystem like this. We have lots of good organizations like Bobby Dodd Institute, lots of really strong employers, a real labor market that we can prepare people with disabilities to meet in the next 10 years. So I think there's a lot of good that can come out of this, and I'm just really excited to be part of the first of a series here hosted by Bobby Dodd Institute. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. I'm going to introduce them very briefly because we didn't want to lose any time to hear from their personal experience and expertise. So I will do the introductions and we'll get right into the questions, okay? So first we have Gloria Puentes. Gloria is Director of Global Diversity and Inclusion at Sodexo. We also have Christine Liao, Program Manager at the American Association of People with Disabilities, AAPD. And we also have my friend and colleague, Ann Nagel. She's a human factors specialist at Autism Speaks. And I should mention, just because I'm here and my colleague Ann is here from Autism Speaks, we're not here to talk about just autism. Just as Christine is not here to talk about only one condition, we're here to talk about all people with disabilities. I also want to just give a quick shout out and thanks to our interpreter, Joe Alexander, and to our captioner, Gabby Lisi, who's here to help all of us as well. So great. After all of that housekeeping and introductions, I'd love to get into the meat of our discussion. We're going to try and keep this concise and to the point. I may interrupt our speakers occasionally, but that's only because we really want to get to as many myths as we possibly can. We've had some preparation and each of the speakers has some incredible value and input to give. So we're going to get right to it. Gloria, the first question is for you from an employer's perspective. How would you respond to a colleague or a fellow employer who might be hesitant to launch a hiring initiative for people with disabilities? Maybe it's out of fear of like litigation. I don't know, I might get in trouble if I have to terminate someone with a disability, or I'm worried about the cost of workers' compensation. How would you address someone who has concerns like that? And Gloria, if you could unmute yourself. Thank you.
And I told myself and then I didn't do it. Well, first I want to acknowledge Todd and you for inviting Sodexo to be represented here on the panel today, and to all my fellow panelists, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this great panel. Sodexo, as a global leader in diversity and inclusion, it is not just, it is truly a part of who we are. And so whether it's hiring individuals with disabilities or hiring refugees, we are always looking to include all people to our workforce. And it's interesting because we still do have those managers who are hesitant. And so the first thing I do is connect them with folks who are already having quite success with hiring individuals who have disabilities. And then if they are still hesitant, there are many agencies like Bobby Dodd Institute and others who provide internships. And so we allow them to come in on an internship level.
That's great. And you mentioned, I appreciate you mentioning, agencies like Bobby Dodd Institute. I feel sometimes that it might be more impactful for a business person to hear from his or her peer than it is to hear from me. Like, they know probably what I'm going to say, right? That I'm going to try and encourage them to employ people with disabilities. But when you hear it from like, wow, my counterpart at our biggest competitor, she or he is doing it, and maybe it's an advantage I don't want to miss out on. Can you talk to that a bit about, that kind of impact, hearing it from other businesses?
Absolutely. Well, and we keep it within Sodexo, but we have 8 lines of business. And so we have them, whether it's a hospital or a university or, a corporate service line of business, we are always connecting them with a colleague, but in a different line of business than their own, so that they can hear from them directly as to how they're working out and in what type of roles they're putting them into.
I see. Thank you for clarifying. I love that's how it's going to kind of spread laterally across Sodexo, hearing from their peers about how great this is working. I love that. Christine, absolutely. Could you talk to us a bit about why it's so important to have a true dialogue, a give and take about the need for accommodations, and maybe beginning with what are reasonable accommodations? in the workplace?
Sure, David. So reasonable accommodation is a modification or an adjustment to the job, the work environment, and the way that we approach our hiring process. This ensures that people with disabilities have an equal opportunity to not only get a job, but to thrive and succeed in their job role. This does not mean changing the essential responsibilities of the position at all. Accommodation can include physical changes like adding a ramp or an elevator instead of stairs, assistive technology, communication, and so forth. Mm-hmm. And I think it's always important to have a conversation about accommodation with the person who is requesting them. Each person has unique preferences of what works for them, and sometimes those preferences can change based on the situation, or it can change over time. For example, I'm deaf. I prefer an American Sign Language interpreter, so I have an interpreter on the line, but there are other deaf people who prefer captioning. And the reason why I want to emphasize the importance of having a conversation about how effective accommodations are is to make sure that it's working for the employee with a disability. Innovations are happening every single day, and with each one, it helps streamline the time between the accommodation. And so sometimes you want to check in with your employee, is that the best one, or should we try other one that might be more effective for you?
It sounds like a simple enough suggestion to check in and communicate and make sure what we're trying is working. Could you talk a bit about the impact of COVID-19? And one thing I know I've heard, and I don't think it's true for everyone, is one line we've heard is, oh, autistic people must love all the social distancing or remote working. It's what they've always wanted. And of course, that's not true for every person with autism or other disability. I was just curious if you could talk about, during this time of COVID-19, when it seems like everyone needs accommodations, how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so David, I think you bring up a great point, because with COVID-19, a lot of us are adapting to a virtual workforce, and we're doing a lot of things that we traditionally have not done before. For example, you brought up one. Some people with disabilities have requested to work from home or remotely before COVID-19. And some companies were like, I'm not sure how that's going to look or how that's going to work. But now, since everyone has to do it, we see that it can be done, especially if you get creative or innovative. And another point that I wanted to bring up is with COVID-19, we're starting to learn more and more about the side effects of the virus. Mm-hmm. Even though someone may recover from the virus, there are still lingering impact on our lungs, our brain, our physical health, our mental health. And so I think it's important to recognize that disability can look differently among different people, and it can be acquired at any time, especially during COVID-19. And so that's why I think it's important to keep those conversations about, is the workplace working for you? Is there anything that you can do differently to make sure that you are fully engaged and participating in the day-to-day work environment?
That's great. Thanks, Christine. And if I could give a plug to a really great public service, it's funded by the Department of Labor called the Job Accommodation Network. You can go to askjan.org and you can find a list of suggested or recommended accommodations that have been effective for others, broken down by condition. So you'll find them for autism, for deaf and hard of hearing, and any other condition as well. And I found them to be very useful. And let's talk about the work environment and the myths around the impact on a business's productivity, its culture, and basically its bottom line to hiring people with disabilities, right? There's all sorts of myths around what it's going to do to our current culture and how we do things. So first, as an expert in this field of human factors engineering, what do we know about the impact of these kinds of decisions or these initiatives?
It's taking me a second to process that for a second. It caught me off guard. Sure. When it comes to hiring someone for productivity purposes, it varies. If someone is having trouble reaching productivity, especially like I work in autism with training, Sometimes I give them a little longer time to train up, but then when they get the job, they tend to be exceedingly good at it. But you might just need a little more prep time to get there, or you might need an accommodation. But if your other option is you hire someone who shows up, just randomly, you have other issues. So you really, it's sort of a take a case by case kind of basis. I work in engineering, and so I work with a lot of tech people, and everywhere you turn in our field, there's someone with a neurodiversity. Okay, and because of that, when people ask, what's it like, otherwise, I work with very productive people who are very big in problem solving, and I sort of can't imagine what it would be like without having mixed things, because a lot of times when the group gets stuck, if we bring someone in with a different point of view or a different perspective, or they're processing information differently, we can get through problems so much faster, and we can solve these really complex engineering things so much quicker. So when it comes to the productivity, the bigger we do have the research that shows that the more diversity you add to a problem-solving group, the faster you're going to get a solution.
Right.
So it hasn't really shown that there have been these huge negatives. So
right. I think the study you're referring to, or I read one that had a similar outcome in the Harvard Business Review, looking at what made the most innovative, successful problem-solving team. Was it age? Was it combination of race, gender? No, it was cognitive style, right? It was like approach to the world, approach to problem solving that I hear you talk about a lot. So, and if you don't mind, are there any accommodations that you use personally right now? Or do you have any examples of kind of universal accommodations that we put in place for people with neurodisabilities or other disabilities that become universal?
Okay, yeah. And I'm also going to take a step back, because when you mentioned the cognitive abilities, also when you're an engineer, it really helps if you have people who have physical disabilities too, because people with disabilities have had to be creative just to get through their daily life. So they're used to looking outside and finding different solutions. So in my daily life, I've been very fortunate. I work at Autism Speaks, but the accommodations that I have gotten have been basically social accommodations, simple things like I stress out organizing Zoom calls, organizing any call. I tell my employees, or tell my coworkers, I'm a show up kind of person. Set up an appointment, I will show up, but don't have me coordinate a whole bunch of people's schedules, because I just can't handle it well. Dave has worked with me numerous times when I do presentations. I usually have David as my reasonable accommodation. He helps keep me on track, because my working memory sometimes will get stuck on something. One thing I do when I'm at meetings is I use a notebook all the time, but it's not for memory to remember something. My working memory will hold on to something and not let it go, and then I will not be processing what else is happening. So if I write it down, I let it go. And these are all just little simple things. They don't cost a company much money. And so it makes me much more productive. It makes it, I have a lot less stress. So also, as Dave and I, we both have a autistic boss. So that helps greatly, because she's always very quick, not just with me, but with all of our employees, saying, what accommodations do you need, even if you don't have a disability? She knows, especially during COVID, how many of them have children at home, or trying to juggle a number of issues. So.
You nailed it, Anne. I want to give a plug to my boss too, who is on the spectrum. Val Paradis is her name. She's amazing. And I think because she's had to think about ways to support her own needs in the workplace for so many years, she's so quick to ask me and ask everyone, how can I support you? And I haven't always had to think about that. And so it's a really good exercise, I think, for all of us. I also will add, Anne, that we don't need to submit a ticket to HR, right? If someone helps you schedule a Zoom meeting, you help me with things I struggle with on a daily basis. And, I sometimes think we're far too formal about these initiatives, these programs, and we're going to track cost and time lost to these kinds of things. We don't do this for any other population. And, we support one another in natural ways on a daily basis. I just want to make sure that that becomes more part of how we do this and how we do business. So to that point, Gloria, how has becoming a more inclusive workforce at Sodexo changed the working environment, changed the culture, kind of the big picture? What has it done for the business? Hey, you're on mute, Gloria. Sorry.
I realized that just as I started to talk. You know, as I mentioned, Sodexo has been on this D&I journey for over 15 years. And so it is really a part of our core and who we are as a company. So we don't make it just the responsibility of the Office of Diversity to create an inclusive workplace. It is getting everyone engaged in really creating that inclusive workplace for all employees, whether they are at the corporate office, whether they are in our front lines. And so we believe it is everyone's responsibility to make sure that everyone is feeling welcomed and like they belong. And it's just a part of who we are.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Gloria. Christine, you kicked off a really interesting conversation amongst all of us here about the language we use to describe disability, and even the word itself, disability. Could you talk about why that's important, why identity and there's a source of pride in one's disabilities in certain circumstances, and why this is so important to make sure we're getting this right for each individual?
So growing up, I realized that people refer disability to a lot of different things. Special needs was the common one growing up as a kid. And then, you know, some folks might say different abilities or varying abilities. And I really want to encourage everyone who is watching to think, why do you say those words instead of disability? We have laws in place currently that protect disability rights as a civil right, laws that are meant to specifically protect people with disability. The Americans with Disability Act, the Individuals with Disability Education Act, and so forth, and they call out disability. So if we don't recognize disability and define it as something else or creating this other than, then you're not recognizing that they should be protected under the law and that a disability is a part of who they are. Mm-hmm. And if you ignore disability, then you ignore the access need, what accommodation they might need. For example, I remember growing up, one teacher said I had a different ability than my partner. My group partner was hearing, and I was like, okay, the only difference is she can hear, I can't. And the bottom line is I need an ASL interpreter. And if we call it out what it is, then I can participate in the group and contribute my thoughts and be a productive group member. Mm-hmm. And so David started talking about a hot topic that is common among the non-disabled and the disabled community, which is person first and identity first. So an example of person first is a person with a disability. And then an example of identity first is disabled person. The preference behind person first is you're focusing on the person and the disability is not a part of them. I see this commonly for people who acquire a disability later in life, or sometimes people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, like a person with Down syndrome. Mm-hmm. With identity first, you're recognizing the person's disability as a part of them. So using myself as an example, I identify as a first generation Chinese American deaf woman. All of those three identities make up the person that I am. My deaf identity has a special language, community, a culture, and that is all a part of me. And I'm proud to be bilingual in both American Sign Language and English. So by recognizing someone's disability identity, you're also celebrating them and valuing them as a whole person, including their disability. Another example of this would be the autistic community, who has a lot of resources on this topic, or the the blind community. But by the end of the day, it's up to the disabled person perspective. If they prefer person first, then go with that. If they prefer identity first, then go with that. It's their choice and no one else can decide that preference.
Thank you so much, Christine. I know it's a very big topic within the autism community for sure. And Autism Speaks recently made the decision to change our own practices here. So we're constantly learning and we don't always get it right. So I want you to know that's okay as long as you're open to learning and having this dialogue. I will share what I hear often from autistic people. Was for some, their autism is not a disability, and they're very strong on that point. That their autism instead, in fact, gives them, in some cases, an advantage, that they think differently and that they approach problem solving differently that makes them more effective in what they do. What I hear more often, though, are people who say, well, it's very much context specific. So one person, if we can think of a made-up example, a man named John, who's autistic, and he lives on his own, and he goes to work every day at a museum. He's only partly made up. John's a real person that I've met. And he's the best museum docent at this Midwest, modern art museum, because modern art is his special interest. John has learned everything there is to know about every piece of work in that museum, and he's able to speak in very fluent language and be very funny when he's talking about his special interest. So he's exceptional at his job. His autism is simply a difference when he's at work. When it comes time to doing something after work, if he's invited to the social happy hour, now his autism is a bit more of a disorder. It's not going to get in the way of his executing and living his life, but he might need some support here to navigate the dating scene and the unwritten rules of an after work drinking scene. Then when he goes home that evening, though, we see autism is a disability, in fact, for John, because he's unable to live safely, independently, without some supports, right? Someone coming in, being paid to help him manage his affairs. So for John, his autism is a difference. It's also at times a disorder, and at times a full-blown disability where he needs support. And I think we need to be more nuanced in how we understand and talk about these terms. The last thing I wanted to do, which I thought was so interesting, and at Autism Speaks, we recently added preferred identity pronouns to our email signatures. And Anne decided not to use gender pronouns. She wanted to do something else. So Anne, could you talk a little bit about your decision there?
Yeah, it wasn't a heavily thought out decision. It was during Autism Awareness Month. And and I was looking and I realized, you know what? I'm going to drop the pronouns. Instead, I put just preferred language, and I put, I want identity first language. Please refer to me as autistic. It's just a personal preference I have. It wasn't really what I thought. And one of the reasons I did that too is because I was only diagnosed within the past 5 years. But there are a lot of other people who are younger than me who are beginning to enter the workforce and things like that. And I want them to also be comfortable. So when I send emails out to, especially, I work a lot with women on the spectrum, it's something that they can recognize and say, oh, wait, I don't have to hide who I am. It's right there. So I did start using identity first. And then I waited to see if anyone noticed, at Autism Speaks, but it was, it was a simple thing to do, but I felt that it was something that really basically states in a very non-confrontational way of how I want to be identified and why it might be important to pay attention to it.
That's great. Yeah, thank you, Anne. So we are approaching the end, nearing the end. We're going to have one more question each, but I'm just warning my panelists that I'm going to be pretty quick on the leash, pretty short on the leash here. We'll try to spend about a minute or so on each of these topics, and then we'll turn things back over to Todd to wrap up. So we've covered some of these myths, and hopefully dispelled some fears people have had. We also wanted to touch on some of the benefits, right? So, Anne, you had started to talk about those benefits of accommodation, of the work you do in human factors analysis. And I was wondering if you could talk about kind of what are some of those positive impacts relating to the team dynamic when a company makes an effort to hire and include people with disabilities like autism?
The big thing when we really notice is it really, like in innovation and in product development and stuff, it really brings in new ideas. But also, even in other areas where we look at, and I'm sure Gloria can talk about it too, but when we look at things in just in like service industry jobs, in retail jobs, a lot of times a person who has brings in different ideas, different thoughts, but they also bring in different characteristics, and they might see the thing as different, and they might, I'm autistic, and most autistic people I know, we are really sticklers about being on time, partly because we don't know the social consequences of being late. But things like that, so that we can bring in different characteristics, different traits into it. And that tends to be very beneficial. I know some autistic people who love to work on quiet shifts. So they usually, I know one who just he volunteers to work every single holiday. No matter who, you want it off, he's volunteering because he's like, it's quieter now, So they bring in a whole bunch of different, just like, I bet I say they bring that, everyone sort of brings that too. Right. It is something that they can bring in different traits, different ways they view their jobs.
I love that, Anne. Thanks for putting it that way. It's a good way to think of it. Hey, Gloria, from a business person's perspective, have you seen any differences in the retention rates of your employees who have disabilities versus others? And just the business, brass tacks here, what's been the return on investment, for Sodexo from focusing on hiring people with disabilities? If you could take yourself off mute, please.
Oh, you have to remind me every time, and you'd think I know that already. It's a great question, though. It's interesting because we have found that especially part-time positions or whatever position, whether it's a full-time or part-time position, they're dependable. Many of these folks, for instance, there have been, in many cases, it's their first job. And so they're excited to be a part of, a team and to be feeling that they've accomplished something. That's what these jobs are allowing them, an opportunity to feel accomplished, and that they're and they love that paycheck, right? Mm-hmm. That they're earning. And so the retention rate has been very high, very steady, very consistent. And it's something that that's why as more of the peers and colleagues talk to one another, they're seeing that, Gloria, can you connect us with this agency, or can you connect us with that agency, because it is working for them. And I wanted to say one other thing that we have 9 EBRGs, employee business resource groups, at Sodexo, and one of them is called SOAR. And if any of the SOAR members are out there, I thank them because they're very engaged with every part of the business in hiring and retention of employees with disabilities. So it's a great thing to have.
That's great. Thank you, Gloria, for mentioning that. That is a common ingredient, I would say, in some of the more successful disability inclusion programs that I've seen. Those employee or business resource groups can be so effective, kind of driving things up from the ground up and meeting hopefully an executive champion like you who can put it into practice. So lastly,
go ahead.
Go ahead, Gloria.
No, I was just going to say each of our EBRGs have 2 executives from this most senior level. I'm just a director. But they have from the most senior level who are sponsors to the employee business resource group.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Gloria. And Christine, our last question is for you. Gloria mentioned a whole bunch of benefits to the businesses when they hire people with disabilities. Are there any additional benefits you'd like to add? And I want to make sure you have a chance to talk about why it's important. We're not just talking about jobs, but we're talking about careers over the long term.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so I think Gloria and Anne both really touched on the benefits. So I just wanted to re-emphasize that people with disability add diversity to the team, and not diverse because they're a person with a disability, but because when you have a disability, like Anne mentioned earlier, you process things differently, you see solutions differently, and adding that in different ways of doing different ideas, and I think that adds a lot of value to a team. And then in terms of promotion and career advancement, I personally, this is a little bit selfish for me as a person with a disability, but I remember growing up and being like, where I see the entry level jobs, but my dream is to become an executive director someday. So where are the executive directors with a disability out there that shows me that I can do it? Because when you're hiring a person with a disability, you're not hiring them just to give them a job. You're also investing in them. You're also believing in them and supporting them throughout the entire career trajectory, and not just at one position, because not everyone wants to be at one position for a long time. Many of us change positions, change jobs, move up the ladder, and I would really love to see people with disabilities to be afforded that same level of investment in companies.
I agree wholeheartedly, Christine. I mean, I don't know anyone in my generation. It seems like everyone jumps laterally, you know, every couple of years they're making their way up the ladder. And then when we get jobs for people with disabilities, we expect them to stay in the same job for their entire career. It's not fair. And I think that some of the lessons, some of the takeaways here, Todd, have really focused on, I think, one, these myths are easy to dispel. We have the data and the experience to back them up. These initiatives are not as hard as some may think it is, or that it may think they are to launch. But there are pitfalls, and the best way to avoid them is to talk to people with disabilities and to let them lead you. I think that's what we're learning here, you know, especially from Christine and Anne, hearing how Gloria has done it at Sodexo. You can't do it by yourself. And you should really talk to your employees with disabilities, or if they haven't stepped forward yet, you know, put a call out asking, saying, look, we're interested in doing this at this business. We need champions. You know, that simple request for help, you're going to get people who are really interested in helping you. Those internal champions, that will be so key. And lastly, Todd, I want to mention that if you are interested, if you're a business person, if you are interested in what resources might be out there to help you, you have Bobby Dodd Institute and Autism Speaks, but I want to mention some kind of federal larger ones too. There's the Office of Disability Employment Policy that's also funded by Department of Labor, just like the Job Accommodation Network. There's Disability In, the national organization. There's the group, the affiliate group down there in Atlanta. National Organization on Disability is a good one too. And then lastly, and this was, I think, some suggestions from our panelists, be creative. Partner with organizations who are in the community. They don't have to be the traditional, you know, disability community services. Find organizations that are working with veterans or other populations and build those relationships. We've seen really creative partnerships that have lasted, you know, many, many years to help kind of build pipelines where they don't already exist. So thank you, Todd. I hope we addressed some of the big myths and we dispelled some of those myths. I want to thank each of the panelists, Gloria, Christine, and Anne, so much for your input, for your expertise. Every time we've spoken in preparation for this panel, I've learned so much. So I want to thank you one last time. And I'll toss it back over to you, Todd.
Thank you so much, David. And yes, Anne, Christine, Gloria, just fabulous job. And Dave, you kept us right on pace with time. So kudos to you on your moderating skills. And just want to say what great conversation was really flowing. I also wanted to, I know that you brought up some points of summary, Dave, but I wanted to share some others that I had jotted down in terms of all employees belong and should feel that way. I thought that was great. I had the connecting with successful individuals who have been through it and can almost act as mentors and case studies. Christine, what you said about accommodations versus modifications and just that language change, I think is so powerful, as is recognizing the disability is truly valuing it. So awesome stuff. So as mentioned earlier, this is the first of a series of virtual seminars that really run from now until, well, you'll see as I scroll down the screen here, through most of 2021. And we have a really wide range of speakers and companies that are going to be involved. A lot of them, most of them have been named, and a lot of them we're still bringing people into the fold. But I wanted to specifically highlight the next session, which is going to be Wednesday, October 7th, from 3 to 3:45. And we have two fabulous speakers for that. Kim Martin, who specializes in special needs and elder law. She's an attorney with Nadler Biernath. And then Philip Woody, who's, you can see, parent and ability inclusion advocate. And he'll be sharing his personal experience. So with that, I wanted to just thank all of you again for this successful first session. And we will give you back 3 minutes of your day. But kudos to all of you. Thank you again, panelists. Thank you to our sponsors. And we'll see you on October 7th.